Hi, everybody. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Michael Mathieu Vibrant Health. This is the next installment of Healing Stories, and I'm very honored to have a dear friend, Jeremy Raw, join us today. And he's got a great story about healing recovery from oxalates. And in his case, his primary symptom was carpal tunnel syndrome. And so welcome, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here, Michael. I love to share these stories because, it's great to give people hope that, wow, I've had this chronic issue. It's really annoying. It's really painful. It's debilitating. And I can actually get over it. We'll talk about how bad mine was because it was pretty bad. And
yeah. So I'm going to say a little bit and you correct anything I mess up, but in our talking right before we started here, Jeremy was telling me he's been a computer guy for quite some time, but never had carpal tunnel issues until some dietary changes started happening. Right. So I'll let you jump in there.
Yeah, and so I actually, that's a good place to start, Michael. Yeah, I've been sort of in computer stuff probably since the mid-1980s. So, I mean, we're going on 40 years at this point of working in the field. And relatively early in my career, I was doing a lot of database support when PCs were first becoming the thing. And you had, for example, research scientists deciding to use those machines to collect their data because it would then be a lot easier to analyze later. And I got hired onto a study in 1989, 1990 that was being sponsored by, Needle Workers Union in New York and being run by the Mount Sinai Medical School or Medical Institute. I think there was a medical school involved in it. And I sat down there and set them up a database. And we started going over this. And I mentioned, I don't know what carpal tunnel syndrome is. That was what they were studying. And the doctor said, oh, I'm really surprised you don't. It's very popular in your field, i.e. computer programming. Well, which put it in my mind like, oh man, I'm a hypochondriac. I should be worrying about carpal tunnel syndrome. And, that was 89. And, 12 years later, I was kind of getting out of the computer industry, shifting over to a different field entirely. I do transportation planning now. I still work with computers and still do a lot of typing. But at the end of my formal computer career, no carpal tunnel. But what happened, the end of the computer career was also simultaneous with midlife crisis. Generally, that's why there was the change of career. I exited my first marriage and got involved with the woman who is now my wife. And of course, there was a giant dietary shift involved in that because I was never, let's just say, a self-responsible eater. I mean, in the sense that, what I would eat was, whatever was on the plate at the corner deli or the Mexican restaurant down the street. I mean, there were things in there that were high oxalate. I did like to eat a variety of foods and I would do different stuff. Oh, Chinese today and Thai tomorrow. I lived in New York City at the time and, moved away from that and really never had a high oxalate diet specifically, although I was no stranger to high oxalate foods. But what happened when I split up with my first wife and married my second wife was all of a sudden her staples became our staples, and her staples included sweet potatoes, Swiss chard, all kinds of interesting vegetables I had never heard the names of, many of whom later turned out to be pretty high in oxalate.
Two of the worst offenders.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that table, it was sort of like, if you showed me like table 3.1 in the Toxic Superfoods book, for example, of the worst offenders there. If you showed me that table in the 1990s, I would have gone, I don't even know what like 3/4 of these foods are. Chia seeds, never heard of. I mean, it's like, and this was the 90s. And fewer people had heard of chia seeds, particularly as a food product at that point. But it was like, most of this is like not on my radar. Sweet potatoes, yeah, they're sort of interesting, but don't really do them, ... And then, by the time I got into, the marriage I'm in now, in its early phases when high oxalate foods were everything, all of those foods suddenly appeared on my menu and were the things that I was eating day in and day out. I mean, probably never a day went by when I wasn't eating, Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, celery and carrots boiled into soups. I mean, there's a pile of stuff that ended up adding extensively to the amount of oxalate that I was eating, not just high amounts once in a while, but steadily all the time.
So like how you gave me kind of an idea on a weekly basis earlier.
Right.
Can you restate that?
Say again? I mean,
before we started recording, you told me about how much you were eating on a weekly basis.
oh, I mean, it was ridiculous. I mean, it was like literally probably a sweet potato or two a day.
Yeah.
Swiss chard was, what's the green by default? I mean, people do broccoli. I mean, I like broccoli, but, my wife didn't like broccoli, and broccoli didn't end up on the table a whole lot. And, instead we'd eat Swiss chard. And so I'm like, wow, broccoli would have been a lot better. It was those kinds of like almost accidental choices that I think, left me in a place where I was not, particularly susceptible to the high oxalate stuff, but also not low oxalate. And so I think when my diet did shift so that some of those worst offenders really did become extensive daily staples, what happened to me was my body was just like, okay, enough is enough. And that's when it really started rolling over into a range of symptoms. Carpal tunnel was for me the worst, but there were other ones as well, and we can talk about that too.
Yep. Yeah, please do mention the other ones.
Yeah, along the way, well, I actually kidney issues, diagnosed at a certain point with blood in my urine, although they never identified a visible kidney stone and decided it wasn't cancer and therefore I was okay, and sent me on my way. And I mean, that happened basically just ahead of when I began the low oxalate transition. That was led by my wife. I mean, she gave up the high oxalate foods and I followed along dutifully as the spouse. It's like, all right, when I'm home, I'm eating what you're eating. When I'm away, I'm eating my good old stuff, which actually, and part of what led to the urinary issues was that my good old stuff at that point was sandwiches from Subway. I've taken a job where I'm traveling a lot. Subway sandwiches are a good, reliable, feels like healthy food stuff. I'd been sucked into the whole Jared commercials and all the rest of that. And they're serving them up with spinach. And I'm like, oh, spinach, that's supposed to be good with you. I'll put spinach on my Subway sandwich and that'll be great. And I did that for a year and a half and ended up with blood in the urine on top of the carpal tunnel syndrome. And I'm like, well, none of which I knew had anything to do with that. But it was basically for reasons like, okay, the Subway thing is unsustainable. It doesn't feel like good enough food. At heart, I'm a meat eater. I always have been. I mean, eating meat was what I wanted to do. So I kind of shifted over to doing sort of like multi-patty burgers and stuff like that. It would be, and then suddenly, just by accident, the spinach isn't part of that because who puts spinach on a hamburger? Today, surprisingly many people.
Oh, I hadn't even heard that one, but it
was like, okay, so that was, and it was sort of like that base shift. It's like, okay, I'm going from the Subway sandwich to the much more robust hamburgers, and the spinach disappears as part of that process. And okay, so we've stepped back a little bit from the precipice of really the decline. So yeah, all interesting stuff. So let me tell you about the carpal tunnel. And
yeah, tell us that story.
So I started, my wife and I moved in together in about 2001. And in 2003, I got my first job after getting a new college, actually university degree in transportation planning. Started my new job working for a city agency, and they had to give me drug tests and a full physical. And one of the things they did was like probe my wrists because they wanted to demonstrate that I couldn't sue them for like developing carpal tunnel syndrome on the job because of their crappy ergonomics, that I already had it. And so he's like probing around, and my wrist is, 2003, I'd probably been really high oxalate at that point for about 2 years. And probably not even as much because, at that point early on, we hadn't really settled into home life. I was a graduate student, working part-time, eating whenever I could sort of grab it on the side. It hadn't really migrated into the full developed version that really happened after I got on the job. But anyway, they decided, yeah, there's a little trace of carpal tunnel. Okay, well, let me work on the ergonomics and get this thing together. Fast forward about 7 years, my wife is in sort of debilitated health condition. I'm looking around. I'm in a job. We've moved to Virginia. We were in North Carolina before. I'm in a job that is, 1/2 of a 2-income household, and my wife is now not able to work anymore. And I'm looking around for a higher paid job. I'm thinking, I should move away, and well, we should move somewhere else. We didn't want to do that. She's sick, we're here, it would be great. So I took a job in Washington, D.C., traveled again all the time for that. And when I started that job, I was already noticing more risk. So we're sort of, 7 years ahead of when it was diagnosed as like maybe having carpal tunnel. And I got there and I'm already having wrist pain at that point. This was 2010. By 2011, 2011 was when I had the whole crisis with the urinary stuff that I was just describing, after a year of eating Subway sandwiches because I'm traveling a lot and doing this stuff. And, I kind of settled that diet question. But the carpal tunnel just progressively got worse and worse and worse. And I'm still eating. I'm looking forward to it. Great. I'm coming home. It's like, oh, you made that fabulous sweet potato casserole. This is great. I'm going to eat half of it right now. And, without having any idea that this was a bad thing. This was like, it had become at that stage massive comfort food. This was the taste of home, to like, Swiss chard for dinner, with some pork chops. Yes, we're meat eaters even then. I mean, we never went full vegan or vegetarian even. I mean, meat was a center part of it. My wife was like a Weston Price devotee from way back, down to the raw milk and all of that stuff. So, I mean, certainly, not having the animal products was not part of the issue. The issue was everything that went along with that was like, these high oxalate super bombs. I mean, it was crazy. I fiddled around and tried all sorts of ergonomic stuff. And then, on about 2013, my wife decided, and she's the nutrition leader in the household. And I'm like, okay, whatever you want to eat, I'm fine. I'll take whatever's out there. I'll find my way. I'll find, eat the things I like. It's like, what do you mean we're not eating the sweet potato casserole anymore? I just got used to that. It was like, oh, nuts. But I went along with it because, I sort of trusted her to sort of find good stuff to eat. And she got better really fast from some major stuff. And
can I pause you real quick for a second?
Sure.
So at that point, were you close to possibly needing surgery for the?
Yes. Oh, actually, that is actually a good point. I mean, I had gotten, by the time, we're sort of, 2 years into the job in DC, picking out of the high oxalate stuff here, having a moderate oxalate diet, although I was eating more nuts because I would realize I'd snack on those when I was taking the train back and forth from work coming home. So there were little things like that where, I was by no means away from home a low oxalate eater. I wasn't a high oxalate eater. It was super high, but I wasn't, I was blind to it like most people. I mean, I had no clue that oxalates were a thing. I had no clue what foods had them and what foods didn't. I was just sort of following my nose to like, ooh, there's a tray of food. I think I'll eat some of that. And, getting whatever was there. I mean, I was, starting by the time I was in the kidney stuff and the blood and the urine condition, I was wearing wrist braces, really. I mean, my wrists had gone between sort of, probably 2008 and 2012. I mean, my wrist health had just completely tanked. I had no grip strength. I was in pain constantly. I'd wake up, multiple times in the night with my hands just sort of like, clenched over and in deep pain. I was wearing wrist braces. And so, fall of 2013, I'd gone in to get evaluated for surgery, or at least I'd started to look at it. And they were like, gave me the whole electrical test and like, yeah, definitely carpal tunnel. You should go make an appointment with the surgeon, which of course, this is considered, quasi-elective. So 2 months down the road for the surgeon. So I made the appointment in December, but didn't see the surgeon until February. And at that point, we'd been on a low oxalate diet for about 4 months. And I go into the surgeon and I'm looking at it and he's like, well, how are you doing? I said, weirdly, it doesn't feel as bad today as it has. I'm just sort of noticing for the first time. And he probes around and says, yeah, there's some impingement there, but I wouldn't consider you crippled to the point of needing surgery. And I'm like, did you read the report from December when they're looking at this stuff and shocking me? And like, it's like, your nerve conduction really bad. It's like, and he's like, yeah. I mean, it's just, but this is what happens. I mean, things evolve in different ways. It's sort of crazy. If you want to, and I said, I'm not a fan of the surgery. I just as soon try and fix it some other way if I could. And I mean, it's gotten a little better. And he's like, well, why don't we put it off? I'm not, in a rush. I don't see any reason that we would immediately lay you down. Your fingers seem to be moving. It looks okay. And I'm like, he's right, but it's not something that I'd really even noticed at that point. So it's like, all right, we'll defer this and come back in like 4 months and look at it again and see if it's progressing and what's going on with it. And in those 4 months, it literally went away. I mean, to the point where by June, and this is sort of 8 months into the low oxalate adventure, the wrist braces were gone. I mean, my wife hated the wrist braces because, I'm wearing these horrible things. I had two choices, Velcro. And I mean, who wants to be slapped by somebody rolling over with Velcro in the middle of the night, or metal clips? And it's like, ooh, that's even worse because they'll actually tear your flesh. And it's like, okay, got to get that gone. We did. And so I dropped out of that, and I was like, this actually seems, I mean, I kept the braces around for like another year just because I was scared to like really have them not be there because, wow, this was so bad. It's like, if I don't have these, I mean, they're a crutch, literally. It was like, but, within a year, I was just, all memory of ever having a carpal tunnel syndrome was gone. And we never connected that to the oxalates until much later. Really, it was after she started doing her research and stuff like, is this the point that I need to make the confession, Michael?
Right.
No, I'm actually married to Sally K. Norton, who wrote the Toxic Superfoods book. And so the adventure that I'm describing here is my side of that life of, the two of us being together. And I mean, so you match the facts on the story and they'll sort of track with what she's put together. I don't want to make a big deal of that because really, where I put myself is, the clueless spouse who is following along with the dietary advice of the person who they trust and who has been education in this area and knows what she's doing. And honestly, a lot of the stuff that she brought into my dietary universe was really good stuff. I mean, I'm a devotee of fresh farm milk, for example, at this point, which I never would have gotten into if it hadn't been for that. So, and it's been, which has been good for me. So all of that is, really interesting stuff. And, and I'm sort of fascinated by the things that were found out about carpal tunnel. So one of the things that popped up in the research, as the book was coming together was an article from the 1930s, which I don't think actually made it into the references in the book. She mentions, carpal tunnel gets better on low oxalate diet. That's just not my anecdote alone. That's also a 1934 article where it was reported that people with chronic, debilitating wrist pain got better on low oxalate diets. Now, the sad part of that article is they never said why they decided to try the low oxalate diet. It wasn't apparently based on urine testing or anything else. Maybe they looked at the people's diets and said, oh man, you're eating a ton of that rhubarb stuff. Maybe that's why you've got the wrist pain. Let's try putting you on something lower. And, reported that they were getting success. And this was intended as clinical advice for other doctors. It was published in the Liverpool Medical Journal. And you think, wow, nobody ever picked that up. But there were references to it later in literature, and notably the one that sort of did it in forever and disappeared it from any public consciousness was a study of Vauxhall Motors workers in 1948, where they had a panel of like 250 workers with carpal tunnel syndrome and related what they considered occupational stress injuries, and were attempting to see what helps them get better. And they were trying out all sorts of things. And so they did workplace interventions and ergonomics and, stretching and, physical therapies of different sorts. And they narrowed it down, and they never thought about, well, they knew from their literature search about the 1934 study. And they narrowed their 250 patients down to, somewhere between 15 and 20 who had recalcitrant carpal tunnel syndrome and said, oh, maybe they would be candidates for the 1934 dietary intervention. But instead of actually just turning around and trying the diet or asking them about their diet or investigating anything about the patients, they tested their urine and they gave them 24-hour tests. And they didn't see any evidence of abnormal oxalate. And they concluded that therefore oxalates weren't the problem. That's not why these people had recalcitrant wrist pain. And that was the end of it. And then there was a mention later in a subsequent article that said, oh yeah, somebody suggested that oxalates might be involved with wrist pain, but that was decisively refuted by this 1948 Vauxhall Motors study. And it's like
decisively.
Right, decisively. The
science
decided they weren't even going to try the intervention because there was no evidence in the testing that they were doing standard at that time. And remember, we've sort of progressed from the 1930s where the doctors who were doing that were formed in the old school from the 19th century. And by the 1940s, this is major science trying to fix, people's health. And it's like the test tells them can't be the problem, and therefore they don't even investigate whether it's maybe a solution and there might be something else going on there. So I that kind of thing just, this is a point that Sally and I are united on, that, bad science is everywhere, and, people do it inadvertently. And I think, and it just goes to say, I mean, there's a quote that she threw into the book that I think is really quite relevant on this point, that, it's not ignorance that keeps us from doing these silly things or not discovering stuff. It's because we imagine we know something that we don't. And we're not humble enough to sort of look at the world with fresh eyes and think, oh, we could be missing something important that's right here under our noses, but because it doesn't fit the picture that we're used to, we can't see it. We're not even going to try to imagine it. We're so busy building our little houses that we're not looking at, the landscape around them and thinking what else might be out there. So anyway, my little lecture on that.
No, it's awesome. That's an awesome share. And it's fascinating and also disappointing that once again, we knew about oxalates 90 years ago, and then we knew about it 200 years ago, and and here it is, we're having to like relearn it from scratch almost.
Well, and it's the thing, and I've been happy to do this. And I mean, Sally reported one of the anecdotes in her book about her friend Ron, who was a pianist. I mean, he's a guy in his early 70s at the time, who was really finding that actually playing the piano had become painful. I mean, he was having wrist troubles and all the rest of this, and he was in the same place as me. His wife is like had been feeding him high oxalate foods for years, and it's like, okay, let's try this. And he actually did, and really got better. And I mean, it was like, okay, I thought she was bonkers for going into this low oxalate stuff. And she dragged me to this talk, and this guy who's like, it's like, well, everybody thinks this low oxalate stuff is bonkers. But let me tell you, I mean, without even knowing that this was a possibility, I started doing the low oxalate stuff, and weirdly, this whole condition went away. Was that the reason it went away? Well, maybe it just would have gone away. I can tell you it wasn't because of advanced ergonomics. I mean, I wasn't doing anything different that I hadn't tried 1,000 times before in the previous 10 years as it was getting worse and worse and worse. It wasn't really probably any other change in diet. I mean, that was the major thing. I wasn't, my work situation hadn't changed. I was just as, healthy in some ways and unhealthy in others as I had always been. I will actually, Michael, maybe if we could go on with this, talk a little bit about, what I've experienced in dumping, because I think, I've also had what I consider to be a kind of, in some ways, a classic experience around this, which is...
Before we go down that path, Jeremy,
yeah, please.
I think this might be a good time for me to chime in and say a symptom I haven't, I've shared my own symptoms in the videos that I've been doing this past year. And something I haven't shared ever is that I graduated with my degree in electrical engineering, went to work for Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York, and then shortly thereafter got enamored by the idea of going vegetarian.
Right.
And I never did then. I did later, but that meant going to the food co-op and all this like really heavy whole grain bread. And I love nothing better than to slather it with cashew butter or almond butter, and then all those wonderful dark leafy greens of kale and chard and spinach, and making my own hummus with lots of sesame tahini. I mean, I went for it and had no idea what I was doing then. And about 2-3 years into working at Kodak, and engineers, we spent all our time at the computer. I didn't have the classic median nerve entrapment of carpal tunnel, but I had the ulnar nerve entrapment, which is on the pinky side of the wrist. And and here at that point, I was already enamored with the idea of getting into bodywork. And I decided to go into this work called Rolfing. We were doing massage training initially, and in massage training, there's a lot of kneading and squeezing with the fingers, and I had to stop doing the massage, because my wrists were a disaster, and then it was showing up at work on the keyboard, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't know if I can do my engineering work on the keyboard and for sure how I'm not going to get into body work.
Right.
And luckily with rolfing, we don't do a lot of fingertip stuff. So I was using forearms, knuckles, and straight wrists. So that was the only thing that made me be able to survive initially as a body worker.
And I think
so it's fascinating to look back and say, oh, yeah, there it is.
Well, and I think so much of this is stuff that creeps up on people. I mean, there are people, who have had issues their whole lives. And I think it really revolves around a point where, the oxalates do, hit you where you're weakest. And I think this is one of the pieces that comes up. I mean, I have, other relatives who have had carpal tunnel syndrome, have had surgery for it. My other weakness is hip issues and sort of hip pain, which, I was also having a lot of, 10 years ago and don't get anymore. Well, I do get some more, and we'll talk about that when I do get back to the dumping. But your point about, this stuff really comes at you and you don't make the connection. You don't understand that, particularly because all of these foods we're told are so healthy, everything is good. It's like, I would never have guessed. I mean, I would never in a million years have guessed that it was, the high oxalate foods had anything to do with the risk stuff, let alone making it better by giving them up. And so that's just amazing to me. And I think it's really a key observation. And I like to talk about this just to inspire people to say, you've got the stupid, cranky thing, and you think it's just sort of me getting old or something going on, and long before it blows into a crisis, you can actually do something about that and improve your quality of life. And it's like, wow, I get to see a lot of the stories of people who write to Sally about, golly, I'm so grateful to you. I was in pain for years and now I'm better. And I'm like,
yeah,
it's me.
Yeah,
I totally.
My dad had both wrists cut.
Yeah.
And then I think he had to go back once or twice for trigger finger stuff, which I'm certain is in a very similar relationship.
Right. And so, my family history would have suggested, carpal tunnel and hips. That's probably where it's going to show up. And sure enough, the places I was having symptoms all along. It never got to the point where, luckily, just really accident of history, we stumbled out of the oxalate stuff at a point where, I can step in without the surgical intervention. And I mean, carpal tunnel, people recognize it as a painful inconvenience and it can be annoying, but the surgery is considered pretty low risk. It's very common. They know how to do it. Doesn't always work for people. But I'm like, why do you have to do this as part of ordinary life? I mean, it's just, I'd like to live in a way where I'm not going to get that illness and have those effects if I can help it. And that's the part I really, I'm really happy to kind of help spread the word to people, because I think, folks should just know that it's actually possible. And I mean, it's so easy to try this. I mean, I did it by accident, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
My wife says, nope, I'm not making the sweet potato casserole. Forget the baked sweet potatoes for breakfast. No more Swiss chard for you. And I'm like, well, Swiss chard I don't really miss. I always considered it bitter and untasty. And
I was going to ask you, did you actually ever enjoy eating it?
No, honestly not. And I mean, it's like, because it's supposed to be good. And I mean, really, there are a million other things. I mean, give me the romaine lettuce salad any day. I mean, this was a big improvement from my standpoint in terms of what kind of stuff I'm being encouraged to put on my plate. But, really I did miss the sweet potatoes for a while. That was like, oh my God. Again. And and the chocolates. I mean, we'd gotten into chocolate at a certain point. I never liked dark chocolate because it was too bitter. And I mean, giving that up was an easy thing. And I mean, I'll still sneak a Hershey's Kiss here and there, but I mean, that's not going to kill me. At least it hasn't so far. So that that's the message. And I mean, it's just people get better from this stuff without even realizing that's what's happening, or worse from it. And that's the other piece that's really so tragic about it. I mean, there's a whole world of just be aware to it. And then the diet itself is so brainlessly easy. I mean, you can sit in Sally's book and look at table 3.1 and say, okay, all I have to do to get my health better is not eat these foods. And it's like, well, there's more to it than that, right? Well, honestly, I mean, depending on how badly into those foods you've been and for how long, I mean, that may be all you need to do to really enjoy considerable health benefits. I mean, even if you're going to have the dumping stuff, and we'll come back to this, because again, I was one of these people who, took the easy road into this. I mean, I was not, it's like, oh, now I'm aware of oxalates and I'm going to zero them out completely and remove them totally from my diet. And this is like the worst possible strategy, apparently. In my case, it was like ramp it down slowly. I mean, take it, kicked out the spinach, we kicked out the Swiss chard and the sweet potatoes, but I was still, I'm still riding the train. I was still unawarely eating nuts. Sally's like, you shouldn't eat the almonds. You should eat something else. I'm like, all right, I'll move to the peanuts. And I'm still eating like an ounce of peanuts or more on the train on the way home. But all of a sudden, that was the only oxalate I was getting. And so, I'm still doing this sort of like phase transition down through the steps there. I'm not giving up.
You even did that part right without knowing it.
I know. It's like you blunder into this and it's like, yes, approach it as an amateur. This is not, super meticulous, got to get really upset about it and all the rest. And it's like the other thing I've been helping Sally with is wrangling her data project because, hey, database, this is what I've been doing for 40 years. I do that stuff. And so, keeping the database of oxalate data means that I've got to see a lot of the reports on where this stuff comes from. And it's like, for a lot of these foods, I mean, weirdly, researchers, and I think there's sort of like this desire to see results, love to test high oxalate foods. So those ones, the Swiss chard, the sweet potatoes, things like this, we got a lot of reports on those. And they're all uniformly, wow, these are really high. But then you fall off into like less common foods that don't have a lot of oxalates. And the researchers are like, well, it's not interesting to test that. There's nothing in it. And so you don't actually see the results. And it's like until this gets to be, really widespread testing, and we have a real clear sense of like why it varies from one variety of plant to another or different stages of ripeness. And I mean, tests have shown some foods get higher when they get ripe, other ones get lower when they get ripe. And it's like, there is a certain rhyme or reason to some of it, but, do you want to add up oxalates to the milligram and try and figure out how to plan a diet on that? A third of the foods that you could reasonably eat don't really have good tests behind them. We can sort of gamble a little bit. Maybe we don't want to do that. It's really about working from the top down. Get rid of the really bad stuff, the stuff we know is high, work this stuff down and just, keep going. It's like, that looks from a test like it might be a little high. What if I got rid of that too? And picked up something else, or, oh, there's a low oxalate looking thing and I could try cooking with that and do something with it. And it becomes this sort of experiment, but really at a certain point, my body, guides me. Another anecdote Sally likes to tell, we used to have a fig tree in the garden and the figs would come in.
Oh yeah.
And after that fall, after I had gone low oxalate, the carpal tunnel's better. There's the figs. He's like, you shouldn't eat the figs, they're high oxalate. He said, but I can do it. It's just like, it's figs for a week or so. I'll just, and I ate like a bowl of figs in one day. It laid me out. I was like, I started getting like tremors in my hands. I became like,
wow,
panic attacks, breaking into cold sweats. I was just, these sort of shooting pains. It was this insane, bizarre combination of symptoms that I don't think I'm doing figs again. So, my mission that winter was like, okay, instead of bundling up the fig tree for the winter, because we live in an environment where they really won't overwinter unless you take steps to protect them, at least that variety, it was gone. I was like, okay, I'm going to use my new strong wrists that can wield an axe, and this tree is out of here. It was like, so that was the end of the fig tree. But so honestly, this has been, I just want the words of encouragement out there. I've become really, quite convinced that you don't have to believe this stuff. It's just like, try it out. It took me 4 months to get to a place where I was clinically, you should be considering surgery seriously, to, come back in a few months and we'll see if we might consider it then. But if it doesn't progress, and, probably you're fine. And I'm
so
like, that was just a few months.
Guesstimate on, because you were wearing wrist splints, guesstimate on how long before you threw out the wrist splints after shipping?
Well, I kept them on for a year. I stopped wearing them in June. So it was sort of 8 months in. I was like, this is really, and it was so strange. And I was like blaming it on, well, finally this combination of repeated ergonomic adjustments, okay, I'm going to adjust my desk, I'm going to do the standing desk, I'm going to put up a different pillow on the bed, I'm going to do other things. In my mind, it was like some weird accidental combination of that had fixed it. And it was only in considerable retrospect, I don't think we were really starting to understand that oxalates had a place in that for, 2 years after Sally had started us on the diet. So I was like, wow, that's crazy. And then she found this, and then later found this report on, from the medical journal in the 1930s. And I was like, oh, okay, look at that. How about that? Could be the thing. But I think the other thing I do want to talk about the dumping, because for years they would say, well, do you have any dumping symptoms? Do you have cloudy urine? Do you have funny pain? So you have all the rest. I said, well, I've got skin issues, but then I've always had skin issues, and I would say which was probably an oxalate symptom as well. I know that years ago, back long before I ever got nutritionally aware about anything. It had dawned on me that, eating certain types of food, and it turned out later that soybean oil was a particular offender with that, would lead to skin breakouts. So, skin sensitivities, definitely. So I will definitely get recurrences of that for no apparent reason. I'm really good. I long ago identified the food triggers and got rid of them. But I still occasionally will just for no good reason show up with, flaky skin. I had some this morning. I'm like, well, what did I eat different? Nothing at all. It was like a standard weekend of the same old stuff. Which is mostly meat for those who are curious, and a little bit of ginger, and then I'll eat a romaine lettuce salad occasionally because I don't want to give up the vegetables completely. I like them. It's like romaine salad with a few little tomato slices on it and some a little bit of onion, and it's good. Pickled peppers, those are great. That kind of stuff, and all of it turns out easily managed. None of that's high oxalate. It's just great. So the place that I have had dumping is periodic hip pains that would sometimes surge up and really almost, and again, this is the sort of thing initially when I first started having this, and again, not right away. it took a couple of years before I was actually even noticing that, I'm still getting the hip pain. It's like, the diet didn't fix that part of it. And then it would go away. And I'd be hobbling around for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden, poof. It's like it had never been a problem. And all the while, I'm still feeling I'm just fine and healthy and all the rest. It's like, my hip is cranking. I wonder what's going on here. And I think a lot of people, and I think there's a point Sally makes in the book, but, she ends up working with people who are, let's just say, suffering the consequences of years of oxalate stuff. And she tends to see the worst cases. And I think really it's been, since the book was published, we hear from a lot more people who are just trying it out and going, oh, wow, this is great. And I don't even notice any dumping. This is like, I'm just better. This is like really cool. It's like, I'm worried about the dumping. I'm worried about the dumping. And then it somehow never shows up, or it doesn't. It would never have occurred to me. And it certainly, in my case, was not bad enough or debilitating enough or attention grabbing enough over time. It's like, man, if we're coming back every week, if it was a frequent thing, but I'd go months for feeling just fine. And I think for a lot of people who have not buried themselves in the oxalates in the first place, if you get at it early and change the diet, you're really not, the dumping is really your body's reaction to years of like, okay, I'm just going to find every little nook and cranny. And it's like, we're hoarding oxalates because if we let it loose, it's going to kill you. And, I was probably never in that state. I think back to my diet in the 1980s and 90s, and there were long periods of time where I was eating nothing that could be identifiably considered high oxalate food. And I was probably going through, the cycles of, yes, I'm eating a pile of it now. That spanakopita would call out to me sometimes, although that's probably not the worst way to eat spinach since it's surrounded by cheese. Yeah. But there are all sorts of things like that where, the occasional indulgence, if your standard diet is really not overloaded with the stuff, is probably just fine not to build it up massively. The really sad part of this is the people who hurt themselves are the ones who really dive full bore into like, I'm going to follow the trends of like healthy food. I had this health guy, there was a health food store when I lived in Durham years ago, actually long before I met Sally. And I'd wander by his place, I'd go out for walks and, because I had to get away from the computer and, I'd find him sitting out. This was great. He runs this health food store. He'd be sitting there smoking unfiltered cigarettes. And I'm like, he was like, I believe in health. I'm like, you're smoking cigarettes. He's like, it's the food. If you eat the right food, it's going to save you from everything. It's like, and I'm always following the food, the supplements, everything else. I'm into the new developments. And I'm like, the lesson I learned from that is the new developments are the ones that really get you into trouble. Even if they claim it's an old thing that's been around for generations, if this is not something people have been doing for a long time, be skeptical. That's my little motto for this. But I'm not the nutrition expert. I'm just the guy who got better from carpal tunnel by accident. It was like, but if telling people this and sharing it with you, Michael, I'm really happy to do this. And I mean, I'm so inspired by your own, recovery from stuff and capacity to get better with this. I mean, it's just been, that's been something that I've just, I look at and say, there is a quality of life improvement to be had. And I mean, it doesn't matter how deep and how damaged the oxalate experience has left you. I'm just endlessly inspired by, the fact that this is hope for, improvements of all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's to me, it's almost unbelievably what's the word I'm looking for? The deeper I go into this path, God, I just want to check in with you. You're getting choppy.
Yeah, you're looking choppy to me. So our connection is probably a little faded here.
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
Yeah, I was saying it does look like our connection is breaking up a little bit for some reason. So you're maybe better now. You're looking less fragmented in your emotion. Okay. So,
well, all I was going to say is that as I learn more, interview people about their experience, and also, as caregiving, I have a lot of university students here in Boulder. And daunting to me how many kids at that age are already having some pretty significant problems, and some of them have listened to me, listening to stuff and made changes, and it's like, oh, I'm much better. It's like I had one of my
possibly work.
Right. Well, one of my caregivers, I was listening to one of Sally's interviews, and he was like, Michael, he said, do you think spinach could cause stomach pain? I was like, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
That's one of the most common symptoms. And he's like, oh, because you use big boxes of spinach. I said, yeah. And he goes, eat 2 of those a week.
Oh my God.
And then he a box of those baby greens, which have beet greens, chard, kale, and spinach.
Right.
And he'd eat 1 of those a week. And he stopped eating those. And he's still working for me. And he goes, you know what? He goes, I stopped eating all that stuff. And he goes, I don't have any stomach pain. And it was like less than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
The pain's gone.
I really, there's stuff that can get better amazingly fast. I mean, it's not a panacea. It's not a cure-all for everything. But just honestly, it's a giant obstacle for people getting better. And I mean, if you think back, you remember Sally's original 2017 talk at the Ancestral Health Symposium that was sort of, her first volley into really trying to get word out about the oxalate stuff. This was like 6 years ago at this point. She characterized this as a public health crisis. And I think really thinking of it that way, that, what we're doing with the provision of these foods and their sort of sanctification as, oh, you've got to be eating this stuff because it's the best for you, really does, because nobody's thinking about the downside of it. It really does put us in this place of, being at risk for being, a generation of people really being deeply touched in bad ways by, what they think is healthy eating. And it's tragic, actually.
Yeah, it's totally tragic. Because I look at my own health, but then I'm looking at families, and it's my dad was a cardiovascular nightmare, and my mother's a cancer.
Your mother was you broke up there.
Oh, I was just saying, even just looking at my own family, right. My dad was a joint, and my mother was a kid, and we blamed it on,
Mhm.
but was it all that? I don't know, because the problem, I'm pretty convinced my parents did, and there's a lot of potatoes.
Yeah.
Then, oh, well, beets some, not so much, but in my own diet, peanut butter was big, and also chocolate.
I remember when I was a kid, I hated peanut butter. It was like my friends would, I grew up in the 1960s. My friends would eat peanut butter, and I was like, no, peanut butter is not me. It's like, give me the real butter. I'm like, white bread.
Yeah.
I was like, oh golly, that was actually probably a lot better for me in some respects. So yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Michael. I guess we should probably wrap this up, because I think we're definitely having connection difficulties at this point.
Yeah, we are. That's too bad.
Too bad.
Yeah, is there any closing thoughts that you want to put out to people?
I'm so happy to be part of your series, because I've just seen, my life has benefited from this. I've watched people close to me get much better from stuff, and, have had this, kind of amazing experience of hearing from people all around the world who are like, this is better. And I just really I'm so grateful to you for spreading the word on this stuff and being as enthusiastic about it as you are. And, for the same reasons that I am. It's like, wow, this was like a little minor health for me, minor health miracle for you, a more major one, golly, what a cool thing. And really getting people to just sit still for a minute, think about what they're eating, think about their health conditions, and go, try this out. It's so simple to just start it. And really, it doesn't require you to be meticulous. It doesn't require you to even know much about what you're doing, except those 3 foods. Let's just like move them off the table. And, the options there for actually experiencing health benefits are just mind boggling. And I'm like, go for it. So if it encourages somebody to do that, great. I wish this to everybody for, good health and happiness and,
Yeah, I'm happy to count on one person at a time, because it's good work we're doing to get people who are at least a little open to hear to it. And the one thing I would chime in is say, if you look at the food list and say, oh God, I've been eating a lot of these for a long time, then you do want to practice a phase transition and go
really,
slow.
it's almost weird. It's like that, the more of it you've been eating and the longer you've been eating it, the more important it is to, not decide you're just going to go cold turkey and quit all of it all at once, because that does seem to be the thing that sends people over the edge into like, metabolic confusion.
Yeah. And I will say too, that it's also worth being familiar with the symptoms, both of what oxalates can do going in, but also what they can do going out.
Right.
Because I do find, like, I was just talking to one of my caregivers who, after hanging out with me for a year, she decided to go keto, go a lot heavier on the meat, get rid of the carbs, and also track oxalates. And we were talking, and she was like, oh yeah, I'm doing okay, really not noticing anything. But then, which is classic, somehow we got into talking about her sleep, and her sleep had been wrecked for a few weeks.
Right.
And I had to do a little educating, and I said, it's really weird how this works. I mean, for some people, it's all physical. For some people, it's all emotional mood.
Yeah.
And for other people, their sleep is wrecked, but maybe everything else is okay while they're coming.
And I think the thing, sort of, because one of the things people complain about Sally's perspective on this, say, well, you're just excusing the fact that it's not actually doing anything for you. You're just like claiming that now, instead of being oxalates going in, it's going to be like you're going to get dumping and you're going to get all the same stuff. And I mean, anybody who's really honestly paying attention to their health as they do this realizes that getting rid of the oxalates improves your health. You feel better. I mean, I'm like, I'm in my 60s at this point, and might as well be in my 40s, knock on wood. I mean, I'm I can do things and feel good. And all of that got better as a result of the low oxalate stuff. And if I've had minor hip complaints along the way, for me, There've definitely been some, probably issues along the way. It's not like everything is now, I'm just Mr. Perfect all the time, every 24 hours a day. Probably nobody is. And I can look at those symptoms and say, yeah, the skin outbreaks, the hip stuff, all of that I sort of associate with, this is just my body sort of fixing itself up and cleaning itself up and making itself go. The thing that keeps people in this, if they're trying to fix the health problems, is recognizing, dumping or not, I'm getting better. And, the baseline of health goes up. Even if you're still, it's not a straight line up. There's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back along the way, but the steps back, they may be acute and painful and really uncomfortable. And you're going to, man, I wish this was over. And then it's over. The other thing that's sort of really odd about it is and I think the hallmark of the dumping stuff is it sets in suddenly and disappears just as suddenly. And in between times, it's like, wow, I feel really crummy. And yet all of a sudden, or maybe this part of me feels crummy, and yet physically I'm fine. I'm energetic. I'm like doing well, but my sleep is bad. I don't know what's going on here. And eventually the pieces sort out, and the baseline rises. And that's the piece that I think is really most encouraging.
Yeah, I concur.
Yeah.
Totally.
All right, man.
All right, brother. Well,
let's both continue the path to help and spread the word. Path to health, spread the word, get everybody out there. Don't listen to that stuff that high oxalate foods are good for you. Find something else. And you can do this on any dietary strategy. You can be vegan if you want. There are still ways to be vegan and low oxalate. You just have to work harder at it. Go for it. It's worth a try. People see results spectacularly fast in some cases, and
absolutely,
it's all good.
All right. Well, thanks again, brother Jeremy. Thanks for joining me.
Michael, always a pleasure. Great to talk with you. And, hopefully this will help a few other people find their way out of painful situations.
I'm sure it will. Thank you.
Take care, man. We'll talk soon.